Hi, everybody. It's Deborah Carter here from Preparation Tech. Today, we are speaking with the lovely Sunchi Chen from the UK. And Sunchi is really interesting because she has a profile. She has a study and a career profile that most people don't have. And I'm just going to read her qualifications because they're so impressive. A Bachelor of Science, Nuclear Science and Materials, plus Nuclear Engineering. And not only that, she has a master's of physics and the technology of nuclear reactors. So this is hardcore, Sunchi.
Yeah.
Welcome. We're so
Thank you
happy
for
to
having
have
me.
you. Let's start off with you telling us what you do and how your work intersects with technology.
Okay, so right now I'm a development engineer and I work for the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I'll just say UKAEA. And what the UKAEA does is they're responsible for fusion technology, for nuclear fusion research on behalf of the UK government. I just joined the role 3 months ago. I joined as part of their graduate development scheme. So the plan is that I stay there for 2 years, develop myself as an engineer there and review. And, I do plan to stay on because I do, 3 months in, I already really enjoy the role. My role as a development engineer means that I'm basically I'm a multidisciplinary engineer. Doing the nuclear-based undergraduate degree and the nuclear-based postgraduate degree, it kind of put me in good stead to be in that role as a multidisciplinary engineer, because doing those degrees kind of encompassed all the different sectors that go into the nuclear industry. So that's things like material science, of course, nuclear physics, but also computing and learning, relevant types of coding languages. So yeah, right now I'm a development engineer.
Fantastic. So describe your typical day. What is it that you're doing and what kind of tech are you using?
So my day-to-day life right now, I mean, of course, working from home, I can only do so much. I actually started the role from home. Um, but as far as actual activities go right now for my projects is kind of pulling lots of different people together into one cohesive thing that can, work towards one goal for the project. So my projects are both material science based. We're trying to develop a type of material that's used for a specific purpose. And my role as a development engineer is to talk to suppliers, to talk to people in charge of certain types of experiments, talking to managers, getting everyone on the same page, and then essentially designing an experiment to decide whether an idea that's brought to us is then manufacturable. So we're basically responsible for turning an idea into something that's physical, into something that's realized, and something that can be manufactured. That's the department that I'm in at the UKAEA. It's called the Engineering Realization Group. And that's what we do. We take ideas, we decide whether they can be done, whether they're doable. Like I said, I just started. I'm only 3 months in, so I'm in the really early stages of my very first project. So at the moment, honestly, it's mostly emails. It's mostly me sat at my desk talking to different people via email, CCing people. It's quite a network. It's quite a big network, even for a small project like I've been given. But what's really imperative, I guess, is communication, knowing what certain people are good at, knowing what certain people's skill sets are and what their kind of speciality is, and then knowing where they're relevant and knowing where you need them for certain parts of the project.
And for that, you need your background, your
Yep, I'm definitely
education.
for that. Yeah, that's what it put me, like I said, in really good stead, because I already have this kind of multidisciplinary mindset, because
Right.
coming from a nuclear degree meant that I learned each part that was relevant for the job.
Excellent. You talk about the different people that you're interacting with on a daily basis. Can you specify the breadth of people in technology, like from computer scientists to like data scientists? What kind of people are you working with?
Yeah, so both those things, data scientists definitely. Data science is something that's a big thing in nuclear physics. Of course, it's nuclear physics is you're dealing with things you can't see. So you're really what you're seeing is their effect on the world around you and the data that comes from that, and learning how to process that is what makes it a science. But yeah, so working with data scientists, working with computer scientists, materials engineers, material scientists, project managers, working with people who are concerned with contracts and budgets. Is really, a very large breadth. Physicists, that's basically everyone kind of falls under these kind of umbrella terms, but even under just the term of physicist, there's different types of physicists. There's nuclear physicists, there's health physicists. Is quite a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, great. I'm talking to you and I see that you're just totally into this.
Yeah.
What about nuclear energy in physics is so fascinating to you?
Um, well, I didn't intend to go into nuclear energy. I did intend to go into physics. Um, when I applied for university, I actually applied for a physics degree and I missed the grades to get that place. And what the university did is they called me up and they said, listen, we have a nuclear science course, which is very physics based. It's a lot of the same core modules. We think you'd be good for this degree. We'd like to invite you to come. And I said, of course, yeah. It was at the University of Birmingham. The University of Birmingham has really strong historical ties to the nuclear industry. So yeah, I said, yeah, I haven't looked back since. And I think even before deciding to go into physics, I always knew that I wanted to contribute in a way that would last past my own lifetime. I think a lot of people have this kind of line of sight, this kind of tunnel vision, to try and improve, their own lives and the lives of the people immediately around them. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But for me personally, I wanted my contributions to last, to extend beyond my immediate circle and to extend past my own lifetime. So going into nuclear energy, I think definitely ensures that. I might be contributing to technology that I might not see in my lifetime. I might be contributing, hopefully I will see it in my lifetime, but to the extent that we imagine it to be, I might not see in my lifetime. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with contributing to that. So I think that's really what made me stick with nuclear energy, seeing the possibilities that came with it.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that. The sense of responsibility and
Yeah.
legacy is really, really wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I spoke with a high school student named Andreas, who's 13 years old, who loves physics in high school. And he provided me with two questions that he'd like me to ask you. So if you would just indulge me. The first question from Andreas is, what kind of technology is being used to monitor dangerous nuclear sites?
Um, it's a lot. That's the first way to put it. Of course, I guess people are quite worried about, dangerous nuclear sites. And I think that's a bit of, that's quite a broad, quite a simplified way to put it. Like nuclear sites are not inherently dangerous. Um, but if he's talking about, say, sites where there may be nuclear accidents or things like that, of course, are heavily monitored, usually by different types of diagnostic particle detectors, I would say. So you need different types of particle detectors for different types of radiation and for different quantities you're looking at. If you're actually looking at, just the energy given by radiation, or maybe the temperature, maybe from nuclear waste, things like decay heat, you would need a different type of detector. So just, a thermocouple or a thermometer. Looking for different types of radiation, you would need maybe a type of scintillator. This is one type of particle detector. Gas chambers, proportional counters. There's lots of different types of particle detectors for different types of particles, just depending on what you're looking for. Of course, it's not all just about the radiation, but it's also about the effect radiation has on biological life. So it's more than just, radiation physics. It also goes heavily into health physics and the effects on tissues, the effects on plants, the effects on agriculture in the area. That's probably beyond my scope, but there are definitely ways to, statistically measure and to actually physically measure the effect that radiation has on biological life. And that's an extensive field on its own.
Great, great. Second question. When do you think nuclear fusion will take over nuclear fission as our primary nuclear energy source?
I'm not sure about when it will take over. That could be well beyond our lifetimes. But as far as nuclear fusion really coming into industry as, as a viable source, I mean, the UK has plans to have its own to have its own fully functional power plant based on nuclear fusion by 2040, in a program called STEP. So yeah, that's only 20 years away, optimistically. But after that point, even if we have, fully working, fully operational power plant, we then have to think about how manufacturable is it. It will be made to be manufacturable, no doubt. But then we have to think about how many can we, how many will people want? How can we make this wide scale? What are the impacts of that beyond just physics, but into the economy? And it's a largely political issue as well. So it could be, yeah. If we do see the first functional power plant in 2040, it will still be a few decades, I would say, before we see any kind of wide scale introduction of fusion that
Wow.
could, that could match that of nuclear fission already.
Right. I'm sitting here, I'm talking to someone who obviously loves this. The smile on your face as you're talking about this. Take us back to your childhood. You told me previously you grew up in a low-income part of Bristol.
Yeah.
Were you interested in physics? Were you a science geek? How did you get from childhood to this?
Well, yeah, low income part of Bristol. It was called Easton, right in the middle of Bristol. Um, and I didn't grow up around scientists. My parents, my mum didn't go to university, but my brother went to university, and also my auntie went to university. So they were the first kind of people I had seen going beyond just this community that we had around us and moving away to seek higher education. But still, mostly the people that brought me up and the people that I grew up around were not scientists. But I was always a very curious child, I've been told. I was a gifted kid in school. I took classes that were usually a couple years ahead of people my age. Um, so I've always been kind of a scientist, I suppose. But deciding to go into science as a career and deciding to go into physics really came when I went to secondary school. I think teachers saw a lot of potential because I was good at maths and I was good at science. And I really enjoyed school. I enjoyed going to school. So they kind of pushed me down that route. They said, you're able to do it. You should have confidence in yourself to do it. Um, the school I went to it was quite a rough school as well. Just before I went to the school, it converted to an academy. Um, but before that, it was kind of notorious for violence and for having kids from troubled homes. And it had quite a reputation, the school. My mum didn't really want me to go to that school, but it was the closest one. It was easiest to get to. My mum couldn't drive. It was just what was easiest at the time. It was a necessity. So again, being in school, I didn't have a lot of influence just from from my friends and things to go into science. It was really the teachers that saw the potential and said that I'm able to do it. Before that, I wouldn't have known it was a viable option. And one particular teacher was my A-level teacher. She was a woman who had an engineering degree, the first woman I met who had an engineering degree. And it was after a conversation with her where she really told me to trust myself, to trust my instincts, and to trust my ability that I realized, yeah, engineering is a viable career for me.
Fantastic. So it was so important for you to have that role model of
Yeah,
a woman, female engineer,
female
showing
engineer.
you that it could be done.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So fantastic. You went from secondary school, you survived this rough school, and then what happened next?
I chose my A levels. So I chose my A levels themselves is kind of a roller coaster because I took them over 3 years. People generally take A levels over 2 years. Um, it's because I couldn't really decide what I wanted to do. Like I knew I wanted to go into something science based, so I picked science based A levels, but I also picked art. And some people encourage me to go into architecture because they see it as this kind of conjunction between maths and art. And what they saw as kind of the perfect career, I kind of saw as a compromise, as a way to be as arty as I can be without losing these skills, these mathematical skills, when really what I wanted to do was a physical science, for something physics, something engineering. And like I said, that conversation with my first A-level maths teacher was what pushed me to do it, was what made me believe that I can do that, rather than going down the architecture route. Then I applied for a physics degree at the University of Birmingham. Like I said, I didn't get that, so I went into nuclear science instead, and it's been nuclear since then.
Now, you talked about, when we spoke earlier, you talked about having to learn different programming languages as part of your study. Tell us
Mhm.
about that process.
Um, there was a few. So in my undergraduate degree, we learned Python. Python is like a scientific code. Well, for us, it was used for scientific reasons. It could be used for many things, but for us, it was for scientific computing. And it's quite an intuitive code. It's actually a really good code for beginners if you want to learn coding. Python would be a good starting point. And then we also learned in my postgraduate degree, we learned Fortran, which is kind of the grandfather code. It's a really old code, one of the first, well, I think the first computing code ever made, from which all the coding languages today kind of stem from that. We use that because it's still quite relevant in nuclear technology, Fortran. We also learned neutronics codes.
What's that?
So neutronics codes basically simulates neutrons in a system, because it can obey such complex equations, such really dynamic systems. To be able to do it by hand is nigh impossible. So neutronics codes basically simulates that for you. So it can tell you what you expect to see in terms of flux, in terms of other quantities that you're measuring. So we learned how to do that. That's been really relevant. That's also what I used for my thesis as well. It was based on neutronics. The types of neutronics code that we used was OpenMC. That I used, sorry, was OpenMC. We also used another called McBend, which is one created by a nuclear company called Wood. I think they're called Jacobs now, actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
This could have been easy. My gosh. Just the technical know-how plus all of the maths. This is not a typical profile for a high school or university student. What were some of the most difficult challenges that you encountered and how did you overcome them?
I think, of course, money was an issue coming from a low income background. That was managed entirely by loans. And some people like to say, it's a loan, but you don't really pay it back because you kind of pay it back like a tax out of your salary. But it's a weird one because if you're from a low income background, you actually end up paying more just to attend university. You pay more for maintenance loans. It's not just tuition loans. If I hadn't had the maintenance loan, I wouldn't have been able to house myself or feed myself. And because of that, I'll be paying much more after uni than someone who's from a well-off background. So yeah, money was a big thing, and dealing with anxiety. Luckily, my university and a lot of other universities, they have measures in place where you can maybe alter the way you take exams. You can have extra time. If there's ever, kind of mitigating circumstances, they can adjust for that, and that helped a lot. But that to be able to get to that point and to be able to recognize that I was anxious and to be able to recognize that it was affecting my work took a year on its own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was quite a big challenge to overcome.
And you're not alone. There's other people that I've talked to that have gone through the same. People of color, kids of
Yeah.
color, that coming out of environments that are completely different,
Yeah.
with kids who've had the best schooling, who've had tutors, who've had everything, and just catching up, which you eventually do, but it's just a process. And there's also this imposter syndrome that some people talk about.
Imposter syndrome. That's definitely still an ongoing issue, really, if I'm honest.
Really? You are all those degrees and all that expertise, and it's still there.
It's a thing that never really goes away because it's not solved by having a million degrees and all this experience. The reason you feel like an imposter is because you don't feel familiar. You don't feel like you're in a familiar place. And being a Black woman in a technology-based area, that's something that's probably always going to be there for as long as, at least for in my lifetime, at least over my career. Maybe 2 generations down it won't be as much of a problem, it will be more diverse, but for the situation as present, it feels a bit inevitable. So I've learned how to deal with it, and what I do is I reflect on my achievements so far, and I'm like, okay, if I've got this far because I've achieved this, there's a reason I'm here. It's not just me pretending to be cleverer than I am. You can't pretend to be cleverer than you are. Someone else has seen my ability and decided that I can do it.
Yeah.
So
You
that's what I
don't
think
pretend
about.
in nuclear energy. Sorry. That's the last place you'd be pretending.
This is what I'm doing for about an hour now.
This is what our sources look like. In
case you wanted to see.
So coming back to that, you raise a good point that I don't think there's too many Black people in nuclear energy. I could be wrong.
No, there isn't.
Have you come across Black people in nuclear energy?
For the first time, actually, this Black History Month is when I did, because the Nuclear Society is a social society at the University of Birmingham. They held a Black History event for Black people in the nuclear industry. So that was the first time I had met Black people in the nuclear industry. It was 3 others. One was a doctor from the USA. One was an engineer from Liverpool, and there was another guy, I think he was also an engineer. But that was the first time I had met anyone else Black and in the nuclear industry. Since then, I haven't really met anyone. I think there are where I work, other Black people, but still a very small minority of the kind of cohort that's around me.
So this feeds into my second to last question, and that is, there's this underrepresentation of females and kids, people of color in the nuclear energy industry.
Mm-hmm.
If we go back to the root of the problem, what advice would you have for parents in terms of engaging their kids around science and technology? What can they be doing?
I think, well, if we get really down to the base, one thing would be to never punish a kid for being curious. And it's a weird thing to say, but if a kid breaks a glass because they wanted to see what happened when it fell, then instead of shouting at them for breaking the glass, you should ask, why did you do that? And if they say, I wanted to see why, it's better to explain why it would happen rather than just outright punishing them for that behavior. Because what that teaches them is they shouldn't be curious about a thing. So I think from a very young age, that's a behavior that should be instilled. You shouldn't punish a kid for being curious. Another thing would be to teach. You don't have to be, a physicist or an engineer to teach physics and engineering. It's all around us anyway. It's intuitive to us, and you can teach it in just the things that we see every day. Why does this thing float? Why does this thing sink? And now more than ever, we all have access to Google. We all have access to all these resources, where if your child asks you a question you don't know the answer to, you can find the answer with very little effort. I think there's no excuse, especially now these days, if a kid asks you a question you don't know the answer to, for you to just say, I don't know, sorry. That really dampens a kid's curiosity. So I think always answer their questions, be patient with children who have questions that you don't know the answer to.
And that's the thing, when I was preparing for your interview, I was sitting with my son and I'm like, I don't know the difference between fusion or fission. Boom, internet, lovely,
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
And there's just levels of complexity. So of course I was looking at the young school children in primary school, but the internet is a really wonderful resource. My last question to you, can you suggest specific software, apps, YouTube videos, tutorials that could get a high school student into physics?
I think when I was in high school, a YouTube channel that I really liked was what's it called? Minute Physics. It's called Minute Physics.
Minute Physics.
Minute Physics. And there was another one called Veritasium. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Okay.
Veritasium. But they basically make sort of short videos explaining physical phenomena, answering really basic questions like, what if an asteroid hit the Earth, what would happen? And it would sort of break it down at a science level in a way that's really accessible to people. You don't have to understand, you don't have to have a degree level knowledge to understand what they're telling you. And it really can pique an interest in physics. It definitely did for me. There's also, because they're YouTube channels, is easier for kids to see them, for like younger children to see them. And like I said, it uses really accessible language. So even if you're, low level science, you can still understand it. And it's still really interesting. I guess for coding, maybe coding is a really big, is really growing because there's a lot of, the emergence of artificial technology and artificial intelligence and things like that. A lot of people are more interested in teaching their kids code. There's a lot of resources to teach children code. I saw one the other day actually called Scratch.
Yeah.
It's a website called Scratch
Yeah.
that looked really interesting. But even before, you know, actually giving your kid a computer and teaching them how to code, just teaching them about communication skills. That's so important when you're learning how to code, because, you know, we talk as humans, we have our own human language that computers don't understand. And the first thing you have to learn when you're computing is to unlearn that human language, to be able to break it down into simple instructions. And I think there's an exercise that that some teachers do in school where, you know, you tell a child, how do I make a peanut butter sandwich?
Classic.
And you don't, yeah, and you take their instructions and you flip it and you make it completely wrong. And that's really to teach a kid about communication and how you have to effectively communicate something. And that's really the basis of all computer coding, because if you have to unlearn thinking like a person and start thinking like a computer to effectively program things. Something I use myself in uni as well is GitHub. GitHub is like it's kind of a community of software developers, and there's a lot of courses on there. I use that for my thesis. Even for my thesis, I use GitHub workshops on there. There's a GitHub Learning Lab where you can find courses. But yeah, most of these things, importantly, are online. Is a wealth of courses, a wealth of information online.
Right. And is GitHub okay for high school students as well?
Yeah, I think there's really accessible courses for high school students, definitely.
Okay, great. Sunchi, it has been lovely. You have schooled us. Not only have you schooled us about particle detectors and all kinds of things around nuclear energy, but your story is inspirational, because you're telling us that it doesn't matter where you come from. If you have the drive, if you're lucky with good role models, if you have the discipline and the work ethic, then you can do great things. So I'm just really inspired by you. Thank you very much for this interview. And
I think it's if I can add a point, it's important to say that that yeah, I am, if you do have the drive to do something, you can do it, but to also be aware that I'm an exception to the rule. I'm not a rule. I'm not just a success story to flout around. When someone considers my successes, they have to consider the hurdles and the challenges as well, because not everyone reaches this point in the same way. So when it comes to someone like me from a low income background, to be able to consider me a success, you have to consider the hurdles I've overcome. So that's
super important.
Comes with it.
And that's why I asked you about the challenges, because we have to stop making things look easy, and we tend to focus on the success and not the path and the hardship and the blood, sweat, and tears that it took to get there. Yeah, we need to be realistic, because it's not for everybody. It's not for everybody. But you made it, so that's the important thing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sunchi.
Thank you for having me.